It's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is practice. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you may encounter the verb practice means to perform an activity or exercise repeatedly and regularly to improve. Now, this meaning is probably quite familiar to you, right? Maybe you're practicing your English by watching these videos or making your own sentences as we talk about and review different verb tenses. And generally, to learn a language, right, it's going to take a great deal of repetition and regular activity in order to make that improvement. Now, a second way you might hear practice used can mean to carry out or perform an activity, a method, or a custom regularly. Okay? This definition might be a little less common to hear, but we might think of parents with small children, right? And teaching their children to say please and thank you. Right? And there might be some prompting. We might need to encourage them to carry out this particular custom regularly. And so sometimes it can take a while to learn how to do this and to do it maybe a little more automatically. So we might say we're practicing our manners, right, to describe what we're doing with our children. A third way the verb practice gets used is to mean to be engaged in a particular profession. Now, this is most commonly used in legal professions, so lawyers or attorneys, but it's also quite common in medicine. So you'll hear doctors say, I practice general medicine, or they might name a particular specialty. So they're talking about kind of working in this area or this field. A fourth way the verb practice gets used is to mean to observe the teaching or rules of a particular religion. You might hear people say, I practice, and name a particular religion. For now, you should know practice is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, I'm going to drop the E on the end before I add ing. That forms practicing. To make the past tense and participle forms of this verb, I just need to add the letter D since this verb already ends in an E. But notice our base verb, practice, ends with an S sound, and S sounds are unvoiced. This means that our ED ending is going to make a T sound. So I'm going to say the past tense and the participle forms a couple times, and I hope you'll hear that T sound. Practiced, practiced. Okay. Now, you might encounter one phrasal verb, and that is to practice on. This meaning connects back to our first definition. So it's learning and improving, or another way to think of that is to talk about training for some activity. You might be doing drills on someone or something. Let's take a look at an example sentence to help us understand that. She's been practicing checking blood pressure on her friends and family. So here, we might be describing someone who's studying to become a nurse, right? And so to learn how and be better at checking someone's blood pressure, right? She's asking her friends and family, and she's doing these activities or these practices on her friends and family to kind of pretend like they're a real patient. Now, let's move on and continue using our verb of the day in a couple different ways. Today, we're going to review the imperative and the present perfect. Let's start with the imperative. Many times, the imperative is referred to as a command. It's something that's a little different in English because we are telling someone or some group of people to do or not do a particular action. Okay? So what's sort of special about this verb tense is that there is no stated subject. If you're a regular viewer of these videos, you probably get really tired of me saying start with the subject and then, right, and describe the process. Here, there's no subject. And that's because our subject is implied. It's understood that it's the person to whom I am speaking or to whom I am writing, or people, of course, if it's plural. So you can think of this as being you singular or you plural. To make an affirmative or positive sentence, all we need to do is start our sentence with the base verb. You can see that in my example. Practice speaking with your partner for the next few minutes. Maybe you've heard a teacher give a command like this, right? And telling their students what to do. Now, sometimes people will say, "Ooh, Katie, this feels a little rude or impolite to just tell or command someone to do something." So if it makes you feel a little more comfortable, add the word please to the beginning or please at the end, and that can soften things a little bit. So you only need one please. So we could say, please practice speaking with your partner, or we could say, practice speaking with your partner for the next few minutes, please. Okay. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the imperative, here we're going to start with do not or the contraction don't, and then the base verb. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of this. Maybe a parent might be speaking to their child and saying, don't practice piano now, it's your bedtime, right? So here we're commanding them not to do a particular action. Now let's move on and look at sentences in the present perfect. First, let's talk about why we have this verb tense. We can use the present perfect to describe an action that started in the past and continues into the present. We can also use it to describe an action that occurred at some point in the past. So you might hear this called the indefinite past. So we might not be sure, did this happen last week? Did it happen last month? Or maybe it was 5 years ago, right? The thing about the present perfect is we need to pay attention to our subject. And sometimes it can be helpful to also remember present perfect, you'll see those 2-letter P's there, you're going to need 2 parts to your verb. So if your subject is I, you, we, or they, we're going to make our verb by using have, that's the first part, and then the participle form of the verb, that's the second part. But if your subject is he, she, or it, we'll use has, H-A-S, and then the participle form of the verb. You can see that in my example. She has practiced law for over 20 years. Okay, so there's that starting in the past and continuing example. Now let's talk about making negative sentences in the present perfect. To do this, we start with our subject, okay, and then we use either have or has, whichever form matches that subject, then not, and then our participle form the verb. Now, have not can be combined into the contraction haven't, and has not can be combined into the contraction hasn't. So that's okay as well. You can see that in my example here. The team hasn't practiced in over a week due to the weather. Okay. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, I start with have or has. Whichever form matches the subject, that subject comes next. Then you're going to see the participle form of the verb. Here's an example of a yes or no question. Have you ever practiced a religion? So we could say either yes, I have, or no, I haven't to answer that question. There you can see a couple of those different meanings to our verb, right? So the affirmative example, practice law. We're talking about being engaged in this profession of being a lawyer or being an attorney. Sentence 2 is that repeated activity. So here, a team is looking to improve, get better at their particular sport. And then 3, that word religion can show you kind of participating in a particular faith. Now, let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb practice. We're also going to discuss a couple of phrases that you might encounter. First, let's talk about the noun form of this word. The noun practice has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation as our verb. It also can have a number of different meanings. We're going to talk about 4 ways to use this noun. The first way the noun practice gets used is to refer to the actual application or use of an idea, a belief, or a method. So not just a theory. Let's look at an example sentence. I have learned so much in the practice of teaching. Okay? Now, I took graduate classes and studied things, studied theories on how people learn. Some of those ideas are great and really helpful. I've tried occasionally something I read in an article, a book, from someone who's been researching, but then the activity just, it didn't work out, right? So in practice, some ideas, some methods might not work. But here, that sentence is describing kind of the application of all of those things I've learned about teaching. Now, a second way to use the noun practice is to refer to that carrying out or exercise of a business or some profession. It can also refer to the premises. So you might think of like the building as well. So again, it's most common to hear this used in connection to law or medicine. An example of this noun in a sentence might be, the medical practice has over 10,000 patients. So here we're kind of talking about this business organization. It's probably a group of doctors who maybe work in sort of the same specialty. A third way to use the noun practice is to refer to the repeated exercise in or performance of some activity or skill. Many times it's used to learn or gain proficiency in something, or it could be just to maintain that proficiency as well. So an example of this noun in a sentence might be, it takes a lot of practice to be fluent in a language, right? Many of you know that. You're investing a lot of time in learning different languages, particularly English. A fourth way to use the noun practice is to refer to a period of time that is spent practicing something. So an example of this might be, soccer practice is at 3 today. Right? So we're referring to the time where we're going to practice the sport of soccer, or most of the viewers will probably know this as football. Now, another related word you might encounter is the noun practitioner. This is a person who is actively engaged in some art, some discipline, some profession. And again, it's really common in medicine. So an example of this might be, our medical practice employs 20 practitioners. This is really going to be another way to refer to doctors. Now, let's move on and talk about a couple of phrases you might encounter. The first phrase you might hear is in practice. This is really another way to say kind of in reality, what's really happening. So, an example of this. The self-checkout is good in theory, but it has failed in practice. Many people have a really strong negative idea to going to a particular store, finding things you want to buy, and then having to sort of check yourself out. out. So scan the items, possibly put them into some type of bag and pay and do all of those things without a checker or a cashier, a worker who is designed to help with those activities. And some businesses are kind of moving away from that. They've found this just doesn't work well. Another phrase we might encounter is out of practice. So this phrase generally means that someone is not currently proficient in some activity or maybe some skill because they haven't performed it for a very long time. An example of this might be, he's out of practice with driving. He hasn't had to drive in over 10 years. I've heard this happening to people who move to large cities, right? They sell their car because it's just too expensive to keep and park, and maybe too inconvenient. They rely on public transportation and they do just fine. And so someone could kind of lose this skill if they're not doing it regularly. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.